Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a New York Times article. It was published August 12th, 2025. The title is CPI, Inflation and Fed Policy. And our mission here, as always, is to really cut through the noise. We've got these excerpts, and we want to pull out the key insights, the nuances, to help you get properly informed on these, frankly, critical economic signals. We're trying to go beyond just the headlines, understand what's really driving things. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's really interesting in the article zeroes in on this is that connection, the interplay between CPI, inflation, and the Fed. It's not just saying CPI measures inflation. It's asking how that data specifically shapes what the Federal Reserve does, their whole balancing act, and then how those decisions echo out, sometimes in surprising ways.
All right, that's a really important point. We all sort of know CPI tracks prices, but this piece, it seems, didn't just define it. It got into something more subtle, like the influence of specific parts of the CPI. What did it say about how the weighting of things, you mentioned housing costs maybe, can sometimes, I guess, cloud the picture of inflation for actual people?
That's a great question. And yeah, definitely a key point from the article. It highlighted that, even if the main CPI number seems okay or is cooling down, that shelter part, which is rent, and this thing called homeowners equivalent rent, it often lags behind quite a bit and carries a really heavy weight in the calculation.
Ah, okay.
So what that means is even if gas prices drop fast or food comes down,
Yeah.
those sticky housing costs keep the headline number high. The article actually mentioned economists arguing that this specific weighting, it makes it really hard for the Fed, harder to know if the core heat and inflation is truly going down.
So it's not just that prices change, but which ones change and how the CPI formula captures that change. Okay. And then the article looked at the real world side, the impact of inflation, moving past just, things cost more. Did it talk about how this specific kind of inflation, the sticky kind driven by housing, affects, say, long-term planning for families?
It really did. The piece illuminated a kind of difficult psychological element for people. It wasn't only about, your groceries costing more day to day. The article stressed that rising housing costs, especially, they forced people to completely rethink their budgets.
Yeah.
Maybe delay big life stuff like having kids or affording that first home.
Right.
It specifically mentioned the stress people feel seeing their savings just sort of shrink against these ongoing unavoidable costs. And that raises a big question, doesn't it? How does the Fed actually weigh those very real personal impacts against the big macroeconomic data points?
And that's the perfect transition to the Fed itself. The article didn't just state their job, the dual mandate, stable prices, max employment. It seems it really explored the difficulty of doing that job right now. So, given what the NYT said about those sticky CPI parts, how did it describe the Fed's strategy? How are they trying to get prices stable without, crashing the whole economy?
Well, the article's deeper analysis suggested the Fed isn't just looking at that main CPI number we see. They're really intensely scrutinizing core inflation, especially services inflation, but taking out the shelter component, trying to find the real signal of disinflation.
Okay.
It painted a picture of the Fed being in a, frankly, tougher spot than usual, trying to engineer that soft landing, calibrating rate hikes just right.
Tuning things up.
Exactly. Tightening policy enough to cool demand, but, and this is the tricky part, not so much that you cause massive job losses. The piece really hammered home the lag effects, too. The rate hikes they do today, the full impact won't really show up in the economy for months, which makes judging things in real time incredibly difficult for them.
So it's like they're driving by, looking in the rearview mirror a bit, constant interpretation, knowing the picture is delayed. What about the flip side? Did the article explore what happens if CPI suddenly cools off fast or even shows deflation? How did the NYT suggest the Fed might react then? And what problems would that cause?
Yeah, it touched on that. The article indicated that, a clear trend of falling inflation or actual deflation would probably make the Fed think about pausing hikes, maybe even cutting rates. But it also added a big however.
Okay.
It cautioned switching gears like that isn't risk-free either. The piece argued that if they pivot too soon or too abruptly, they might accidentally fire up inflation expectations all over again.
Right, back where we started.
Or if deflation really took hold, that's its own economic problem. People stop spending, businesses stop investing, because they expect prices to fall further. The NYT piece really framed the Fed's current challenge as Not just picking the right path, but also managing everyone's expectations markets, the public, around any change in direction.
Okay, so let's try to quickly recap what we've pulled from these New York Times excerpts. We've looked beyond just the basics. We understand, hopefully a bit better now, how the makeup of the CPI data, especially those lagging parts like housing, gives us a complex signal on inflation.
Hmm.
We saw how these stubborn price increases aren't just abstract. They hit purchasing power and affect big life choices, something the article really emphasized.
Definitely.
And finally, we explored the Fed's very careful strategy, how they're navigating these challenges, dealing with those time lags, walking that tightrope, as the NYT described it, to get stability without wrecking the economy. These aren't just numbers floating around. They are, as the article showed, direct insights into the forces shaping your financial world.
And what's really key here, I think, is remembering these things aren't static. They're always shifting. The value of understanding these nuances, like from this NYT piece, the components of CPI, the lag effects of policy, it lets you look past the simple headlines. It empowers you, really, to interpret the economic signs that are directly impacting your life, your finances.
Absolutely. Well said. So, what does this all mean for you? As you watch the economy evolve, maybe think about how this deeper dive understanding CPI's quirks, inflation's real world bite, and the Fed's complex job, how that might change the way you read the news, or even how you approach your own financial planning down the road. Something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us.